Good afternoon. I am Tiffany Turner, lead crisis counselor for Eagle Mountain Saginaw ISD, and we are here with a few members of our counseling department and a special guest today to talk about trends in mental health and tips for your family in order to keep your kids and yourself mentally healthy. Before I introduce our presenter, I did want to speak to questions that you guys may have. You can submit questions throughout the presentation, and we will answer all of those at the end. We would ask that you not put in personally identifying information just because we don't want your private information out there. But if you will submit a question, we will definitely get to those at the very end. So we will hear from 4 people today. And our main presenter today is Natalie Ovsharov. She's an LCSW and a clinical therapist at Cook Children's. And we are so glad to have her and her expertise to share some information with us today. Natalie, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. I'm going to be sharing a presentation today that was written by our lovely director of psychiatric services at Cook Children's. Her name is Lisa Farmer. She's a social worker and she's a nurse. And it says the 4th wave of the pandemic. I don't know about y'all, but I feel like we're on like the 6th, 7th, 8th wave by now. I don't even know. But it definitely has been, it's been a long journey. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the struggles for mental health care access prior to the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic on mental health, specifically with our kiddos. And then I'll explain the challenges related to these increasing needs, and then we'll talk a little bit about some possible solutions. So challenges before the pandemic. We have a huge need in Tarrant County, and I'm sure in most of the counties in the U.S. For psychiatric care. And as you can see from the numbers on this screen, we do not have nearly enough adolescent psychiatrists to be able to provide for all of those needs. Psychiatrists are medical doctors that would provide mental health medication. So those are just the physicians. This is not talking about counselors or psychologists. This is just for medication management. There's a huge shortage. We should have, you can see the recommendation on the top list, 47 child and adolescent psychiatrists per, I guess that's 300K kiddos. And we don't have anywhere near that. We have that little second green bubble says Tarrant County child and adolescent psychiatrists per 100,000 are 4.6, which is insane to me to even wrap my head around that. So our psychiatrists are also incredibly stressed and overworked and burned out, and this is before the pandemic. Another barrier to care even before the pandemic was the access to psych beds. So these are specifically inpatient psychiatric beds that are available for kids. And then it also lists on this slide, you can see adults as well. So the population of Tarrant County is 2 million. An average bed need in inpatient psychiatric facilities across Tarrant County would be 1,000 adult and child beds. The actual number that we have available in Tarrant County is 536 beds. So we have just over half of what we need. And again, this is before the pandemic. Something that we struggle with in our hospital setting is patients that have primary medical diagnoses, but they may have co-occurring psychiatric diagnoses or high-risk behaviors. And so we're not just seeing psych patients, we're seeing people that, kiddos that have chronic illness as well. And so my position at the hospital, my home department is psychiatry, but the clinical therapy role is actually specifically for kids who have a medical diagnosis who are also experiencing some mental health and behavioral needs. So my area that I'm in is cardiology. So I only see cardiology patients. And so that means that basically if we have a kiddo that comes in for heart surgery, they're probably experiencing a lot of anxiety before that surgery. And even after, they may feel sad about having to be in the hospital for a couple weeks. And there may be body image issues because of the scar on their chest and, the limitations on their physical activity and missing school, all that kind of stuff. And so that's where I'll be consulted to see them, to help them work through not only their chronic illness and the stress that that causes on them, but also kind of the outside influences that cause kids to really struggle when they have a chronic illness. And so we also have hospitalist clinical therapists, and I help them out pretty regularly. Right now, I help them on all day on Mondays, and those are the clinical therapists that will see our kiddos who don't have a specialty. So like if a kid is followed by cardiology and they come into the hospital, they're going to be seen by me. If they are followed by oncology and they come into the hospital, they're going to be seen by our oncology clinical therapist. But if they're not followed by anybody, they come in because they broke their arm or they were in a car accident or a suicide attempt or any behavioral issue, our hospitalist clinical therapist will see them. And so when we do that, we're doing an assessment and then recommending treatment. The tricky thing with this is that we're treating kiddos with behavioral issues on medical floors, because when someone comes into the emergency department for a suicide attempt, if they're medically stable and safe, we don't see them actually. We have a different team of therapists that works just in the emergency department, and they'll be directly transferred to a psychiatric facility. But if they have attempted suicide and they need medical treatment, meaning they're altered in some way, like mentally altered, they have some type of physical injury that needs to be treated, they transfer to the medical floor, which has been a challenge for our staff because medical floor staff is not always well versed in psychiatric patients' needs. And so that's a collaborative effort for sure there. Patients who need an inpatient psychiatric bed, but there's none available because of that previous slide I mentioned, that we have just over half of the beds that we need in Tarrant County. They end up just sitting on our medical units. So we may have, like on the cardiology floor, we may have most of the rooms are cardiology patients, and then we'll have 2 or 3 that are kiddos who have attempted suicide by drug ingestion. And so they have, their hearts have to be monitored because that can cause heart attack, it can cause irregular heart rhythm, that kind of stuff. And so they're on the cardiology floor. And so that's a whole nother challenge because we have a policy where we make the room safe for psychiatric patients. And so we take out all the sharps, we take out like trash bags, trash cans, we take out anything that could be a ligature point, we put padding on the beds, all kinds of stuff that our staff does to make the room safe for those kiddos. And so they're actually on a medical floor until they medically clear and we find a placement for them in a psychiatric facility. So now here's the pandemic. This is a little visual of that first wave where there was just, you can see that huge purple spike of immediate mortality and morbidity of COVID-19. And then the second wave was when we started seeing the impact of resource restriction on urgent non-COVID conditions. So like a lot in cardiology, a lot of our heart surgeries were postponed, the ones that could be. not because they weren't necessary, but because of COVID, we shut down as many services as we could to try to keep people and kids, staff and kids from getting sick. And then the third wave, we started seeing the impact of interrupted care on chronic conditions. So a lot of kiddos that I see in cardiology, their families would tell me, like, we have an appointment with our cardiologist, but it's not for another 10 months. Like, the wait list was just super long because we cut how many appointments we were doing per day. And then the fourth wave, which we're sort of in, maybe on the tail end, we're probably in, like I said, the fifth, sixth, seventh wave now. We started really seeing the effects of psychological trauma, mental illness, economic injury, and burnout. And that's with staff and with all of you. This is something that we are all dealing with together. And we're exhausted. We're all exhausted. So you may have noticed that some of your kids since the pandemic have become more disruptive. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Some of them listed here are maybe if some of your kids are in special ed classes, some of those were shut down. I'm not sure about in y'all's ISD what that looked like, but I know in other ISDs that was very much restricted, and especially virtual school. Different ISDs did it for a different amount of time, but some of these kids, for 1 to 2 entire school years were online. And that kids are not meant to learn that way. That was something we had to do to adapt in the pandemic, but it's really hard for kids to sit. It's hard for me to sit and focus on online learning all day. So, I mean, our kids are feeling that energy that they need to get out. They're also facing isolation. They're used to going to school and seeing their teachers and seeing all of their friends and playing and interacting. And during the pandemic, especially when we were in lockdown, it was just your family. That's it. And that's extremely stressful for kids. And then increased stress at home because we're all just stressed out. So kids are feeling that. They're seeing that parents are stressed out as well. You may notice that some kids also have become more depressed. That can be struggles with virtual school. I did not realize how hard that was going to be on kids until some of my outpatient kids really opened up to me about that. And a lot of children find it just academically difficult to learn online. They said, I can't have to click the little button to raise my hand and I have to wait for my teacher to answer. And sometimes too many people are clicking and sometimes they can't answer me. And if they do answer me, then they mute my mic so I can't ask a follow-up question. And there's just a lot of nuances that, we may not have even considered that cause kiddos to have a hard time learning online versus in person. Again, the isolation that we all experience, the loss of extracurricular activities, this was huge. A lot of our kids live to play sports and to go to book club and student council and all of the fun things that we get to do normally, and a lot of those were taken away. High school, senior prom, and graduation, and huge things some of these kids just completely missed out on. Again, increased stress at home, and then little to look forward to. I know I've said, and several of my friends have said, it feels like this thing is never going to end. And if we feel that way in our rational adult brains, then think of how kids must feel. It just looks like there's no light at the end of the tunnel for these kids. And thankfully now, in present day, things are looking up and we are seeing that light at the end of the tunnel. But for 2 years-ish, that was not the case, and that takes a huge toll on our kiddos' mental health. We have seen an increase in patients who have attempted suicide. You can look at the chart and see how those numbers are just skyrocketing. We've seen a 132% increase in hospital-wide clinical therapy consults specifically for suicide attempts. Now remember that the kids who come into the emergency department for a suicide attempt who do not need medical treatment, who can just immediately transfer out to a psychiatric facility, clinical therapists don't see them. So these are just the kids who took enough medication or cut themselves deeply enough or whatever, and they needed medical stabilization. Those are the kids that we're talking about. And we see them on the medical floor, like I mentioned, like the cardiology floor, and then we also see them in our pediatric intensive care unit. So some suicide risk factors would be previous suicide attempts, history of substance abuse, physical disability or illness. If our kiddos know someone, like a friend or family member who has died by suicide, online bullying is really a huge issue right now. If they have a mental health condition, like if they have anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder, that's a risk for suicide. The recent death of a family member or close friend, especially like think of all our sweet kids who have lost loved ones due to COVID. That grief is just very, very heavy on them in addition to everything else that's going on. So that's a huge risk factor as well. Relationship problems. I don't know if y'all remember teen dating or even like our cute little 10, 11-year-olds who got their little boyfriend or girlfriend. It feels like your entire world is wrapped up in that person. And so we may see it as like puppy love or, oh, they're just, kids. But for them, that is a breakup is just the end of the world. And so we regularly see kiddos who have attempted suicide because their relationship ended or there was some type of relationship stress. And then the last one is access to harmful means. Kids can't hurt themselves if they don't have anything to hurt themselves with. So we always encourage if there's a firearm in the home to lock it up in a safe. Your kids should not have access to the code or to the key to open that safe. And we also recommend that bullets be stored separately from the firearm. And if your kiddo has never exhibited any warning signs of suicidal thoughts, then of course you can be a lot more lenient. But for our kiddos who have attempted suicide, we do ask parents to sign a contract agreeing to lock away all sharps, kitchen knives, scissors, safety pins, and all weapons and anything that they could use to hurt themselves, like chemicals, anything like that, which as you can imagine is probably really hard to adjust your home to look like that. But these are risk factors for suicide. Some warning signs. This is what we as parents and as caregivers and educators can be looking at. This little is path warm, that stands for one, ideation. So if kiddos are saying something about wanting to die, or if they're frustrated and they're like, I just should kill myself, or I just want to die, that would be ideation. They're having those thoughts. Substance abuse is also a warning sign that we know when we use substances that we can become a lot more impulsive. And so that's something that can cause impulsive suicide attempts. Purposelessness, no reasons for living. Anxiety, feeling trapped, like there's no way out, like there's no ending to this thing. Hopelessness, feeling that things will never get better. Withdrawal, if you notice your kiddo spending a lot more time in their room, not wanting to go out with friends, not enjoying things that they normally enjoy, that's definitely a warning sign. Anger, sometimes, especially for boys, but really any kiddo, it can be easier to be angry than to be sad. Sometimes it's really uncomfortable to be sad, and so we prefer to be angry. Recklessness, risky acts, unthinking, doing things that could cause harm to themselves without really caring. That's a warning sign. And then really dramatic mood changes or mood swings can also be an indicator that something's going on. Mitigating and protective factors. These are things that that help whenever kiddos are experiencing suicidal ideation. Effective clinical care. That would mean seeing a psychiatrist if necessary, seeing a counselor, having support around them, family, community, friends, access to clinical interventions, learning and applying coping skills, problem solving, self-care, restricted access to lethal means. So having firearms and weapons secured is definitely something that's going to help keep your kids safe. And if they can experience a sense of belonging and identity, whether that come from church or a club or a group of friends in the neighborhood, those are all protective factors. And then also cultural and religious beliefs are protective as well, because we some kids feel like that gives them their faith or their culture, gives them a reason, a meaning for life, a purpose for life. Psychiatric facilities are at a reduced capacity due to the pandemic and CDC requirements. This is changing. This is getting better. But throughout the pandemic, we did see that we could not accommodate as many kids. So in our inpatient psychiatric unit, we have 12 rooms, and they have 2 beds each. And pre-COVID, we had 2 kiddos in those rooms. And so when COVID started, CDC required that we only have 1 kiddo in a room. And so, I mean, that just slashed our beds in half. And so that was really, really hard. And that happened with all facilities. And so it was really hard to accommodate our kids that needed a bed. JPS even converted their adolescent unit to adult COVID psychiatric unit for several months. And so they were thankfully able to accommodate a lot of adults who had COVID and a psychiatric condition, but that took away beds from adolescents. And so children's hospitals, us and Dallas Children's really felt the stress of that. So what can we do to address the problem? It starts with access to care, reimbursement for care, funding for mental health care, and then advocacy. We always talk about that funding is needed in a lot of different areas. Mental health is one of those areas that is typically chronically underfunded. We need an increase in number of psychiatric beds. That's pretty clear. We need to have more places to help our kiddos. So we need to also think about expanding mental health services into schools. And you guys are so wonderful to have your school counselors. And even really, I think probably most teachers have like, they should get an honorary counselor title by this point, because I know that you guys are so, so helpful and so supportive to your kids. And sometimes kids tell me that they cannot talk to their parents, but they can talk to their teacher, or they can talk to their school counselor. And so you guys are incredibly important, just being there for kids to talk to. But also when y'all respond quickly by calling CPS or having a kiddo transferred to the emergency department because of something that they've told you about having suicidal thoughts, or some abuse that has occurred, or unsafe situation in the home. You guys are on the front lines, and a lot of the time y'all are the difference in helping these kids get the services that they need. Telehealth options for mental health have been wonderful during the pandemic. This is something that we never did before at Cook Children's. We have never offered counseling through telehealth, and it was a huge deal that insurances started allowing us to do that. So insurances have said, we will reimburse for telehealth, for you to do counseling through telehealth just during the pandemic. So it was kind of like an emergency allowance. And we are lobbying for that to continue. even past the pandemic, there are so many kids who have benefited from this because maybe they had transportation issues, or maybe they live in a really rural area where they don't, it take an hour to drive into a facility, or maybe they're sick and they can't leave the house. Maybe they have severe anxiety and they don't want to leave the house. Telehealth has allowed us to reach so many more kids and families that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise. There's some advocacy that's been done by Dr. Kia Carter. She's one of our psychiatrists, and Dr. Kristen Perch. She's also another one of our psychiatrists. They have gone on news outlets. They've given presentations on NBS, CBS, Fox, all kinds of places. They have met with the Texas House Representatives Appropriations Committee. They've met with the Texas Senate Committee on Health and Human Services hearing. So we are super, super proud of them and the work that they're doing to try to get our kiddos the treatment that they need. In addition, Cook opened a new inpatient psychiatry unit in 2017. Our emergency department has been 5 rooms have been retrofitted for behavioral health patients, meaning those rooms are safe for kiddos that may have thoughts of hurting themselves. And then we've hired 2 child and adolescent psychiatrists in the past few years, like 2 additional to what we already had. And then also we do suicide screening for every single one of our kiddos that comes into our facility, whether it's a direct admission or they go through the emergency department. Every kid that's 10 years or older, soon to be 8 or older, their medical professionals will ask them a couple of questions to determine if they're struggling with any mental health issues or issues of harming themselves. And if they are, that triggers a clinical therapy consult, and then we go visit with the kiddo and investigate more and see if they need our help. We've also integrated therapists into our neighborhood clinics. We have a bunch of little clinics that are kind of like primary care offices or like urgent care clinics, and there are therapists at some of those as well. It definitely is a collaborative effort. We have to raise awareness with our staff and with our parents. And giving staff and parents some of these warning signs to look out for is incredibly helpful because nobody knows your kid better than you. And when they're on the medical floor, staff their nurses and their caregivers are going to see them more than I would. I'm not going into a room unless I'm consulted. So I really am relying on nurses and doctors and patient care technicians and echo techs and all those awesome people to say, hey, this kid is saying something or doing something that, doesn't feel right. Can you visit with them? Working with patients with challenging behavior is, and also kids with high risk behavior is something that we're seeing more commonly too. And so we're working with staff. When I say we, I mean mental health professionals are working with our medical staff to make sure that we address patient care from all angles. We want to offer, we want to take care of their physical health, their mental health as well, and their emotional health too. We have the Joy campaign at Cook Children's, which is a suicide prevention communication initiative. We recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic isolation has caused a lot more kids to suffer from suicidal ideation. We also understand that there's a problem with over-the-counter medications that, of course, we all have like a bottle of Tylenol or Advil in the cabinet. And when kiddos are having suicidal ideation, a lot of the time that is what they turn to hurt themselves. So they have access to those medications that we think are harmless, but taken in large quantities, they are very harmful. So that's something to consider for your household as well. The impact of social media can be sometimes a good thing, but unfortunately, a lot of times it causes body dysmorphia. It causes kids to be at risk for cyberbullying. It causes FOMO, fear of missing out. jealousy, and all kinds of issues that we're seeing with adults and with kids who are spending a lot of time on social media. There are unique challenges that minorities face, and those that are socioeconomically challenged. We definitely try to be very mindful of those issues as well. And then the effects of suicide on families, that's something that the Joy campaign educates on as well. And questions, I understand, will be kept to the end of today. Here's our sources. And again, this was written by the Director of Psychiatric Services at Cook Children's. Thank you guys so much for your time.
Colleen, we will pass to you for your portion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you for being here. My name is Colleen Rustin. I am a social worker in Eagle Mountain Saginaw ISD here at Creekview Middle School. I do want to kind of touch on some of the things that Natalie said and share some statistics with you all about mental health, the state of mental health right now. I think I froze. There we go. So these are some key findings from Mental Health America. If you haven't heard of them, they're an excellent resource. They are a nonprofit agency that is dedicated to addressing the needs of those living with mental illness. And every year they provide an annual report on the state of mental health. They provide a lot of statistics for us where we can find out how youth are affected by what's going on. The major takeaway here, because I know this is a lot of stats, is that we know that the majority of youth who are diagnosed with depression or anxiety, they're actually not receiving any mental health treatment. And even in those states that have access to care, which Texas is not really one of those, we have pretty limited access, as Natalie was kind of pointing out. We know that most kids are really just going without treatment. And we know that over time, the most benefits from therapy, if you're participating in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is pretty effective, it takes time. So those kiddos should, hopefully be going for 12, sometimes up to a year, 12 to 18 months. And a lot of times we're not seeing that, whether it's affordability or access to care. Those are some barriers that we're seeing in our youth. Next slide, please. So yes, Texas ranks last in access to insurance, access to treatment quality and cost of insurance. This goes for kids and adults. And then we also rank almost last in mental health workforce availability. So what Natalie was saying, that we have all of this need and a lot of increased need even before COVID. And now we're seeing that there are not enough providers to address that need. But not to be all doom and gloom, I always like to give a little positive push here. I do want to share that coming in the future, hopefully by this summer, all telecommunication companies will be able to make changes so that 988 will be the new 3-digit contact number for the National Suicide Prevention Line. So instead of having to know an 800 number, just like you would call 911, it's an easy to remember way to access some mental health emergency services. It will be up to our state to fund that, but fingers crossed this summer we should see some changes in kiddos being able to access emergency services pretty urgently, pretty immediately, which will be great. And then for our district, we do have an Aspire 2025 plan. One of the goals that our district is working towards is creating a system of support where staff and students, their social and emotional needs will be met. We provide presentations every year. We get to do these wonderful presentations to give parents support and information. And our district is growing at a huge rate. So we are just going to continue providing that social and emotional learning with a lot of different counseling staff. We have our team here with several social workers available as well to give additional mental health support. And moving on to Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Strawbridge. I am one of 3 social workers that cover all of the elementaries for Eagle Mountain Saginaw. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what you do as a parent if you are having some issues and you need some help. Schools are often the first place you turn because they're in the neighborhood, you know the staff, we're readily available from August to June. You know, we're a good, handy place to start. So if you have mental health, behavioral, or academic concerns about your child, or you need help finding community resources, or just you need someone to bounce some ideas off of, please contact one of the counselors at your child's school. All elementaries have a full-time counselor, and our middle school and high school have multiple counselors. And then there are other interventionists on your secondary campuses, and your elementaries share the 3 social workers. For a couple of different direct places to go for issues that have come up a lot in the last couple of years, if you have a concern about discipline or bullying, speak with your principal or your assistant principal. They're the ones that will start the conversation, and then if it needs to go on to a counselor or someone else, they will move it there. If you have questions about 504 plans, on the elementary and middle school level, those are your school counselors. On your high school level, it's your 504 coordinator. If you have special ed questions, either your diagnostician for the campus or the LSSP can answer those. And if you need help finding just resources, food, water, electric, whatever resources you need help with, you can reach out to the counselor, and either they can help you or they will refer you on to one of the social workers or interventionists in the district. And as always, if you have questions about grades or classroom policies, please start with the teacher, and then they will help. If they cannot help, then you can move up into the assistant principal and principal. So now I'm going to hand it over to Andrea.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Lowe, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I am housed at Wayside Middle School. I'm going to be talking about resilience and supporting mental health and wellness. Resilience is the ability to withstand adversity and bounce back from difficult life events, much like a rubber band. When pulled and put under stress, will return kind of back to its original shape. So the APA lists 10 tips for building resilience in young people and adults, fostering social connections, building social supports, friendships, family relationships, helping children by having them help others. It often makes us feel good about ourselves and takes our mind off of the things that bother us. Maintaining a daily routine. It helps ground us. Taking breaks from sources of stress, even if it's just pushing yourself away from a desk, taking a deep breath, that is a break, and we need it. Our systems need it. Teaching self-care, modeling it for your children, modeling it for your students, right? Setting realistic goals. You might have to break things up. Nurturing positive self-image. Keeping things in perspective. Encouraging self-discovery. And accepting change as a part of life. Learning to be present and flexible. I like to use kind of the noodle as a metaphor with kids, that we don't want to be like the noodle that hasn't been cooked, because when you bend it, it breaks. But if you've already boiled the noodle, right, then it's flexible and it can bend and it doesn't break. Some other ways that we build that resilience and strengthen it, developing self-awareness. How do we respond to stress and adversity? Identifying our strengths and weaknesses as well as our kids, building self-regulation skills. So just our ways that we reduce stress, guided imagery, breathing exercises, mindfulness training, all of these things that help us, learning to identify and connect our thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And you can do these things in counseling. There's lots of really good information on the internet and Google, so that you can find these things on your own as well. Coping skills such as journaling, reframing our thoughts, kind of thinking about how we might think about things differently. Exercising, spending time outdoors, a little sunshine is good for us all. Again, focusing on our relationships, improving sleep hygiene. Sleep is hugely important, and there's lots of ways that we can improve it if we're struggling. Tapping into our creative outlets, You know, what have we never done that maybe we'd like to try? Painting. There's so many different things. Increasing optimism. People who are more optimistic tend to feel more in control of their outcomes. Building optimism, we can focus on what we're able to do when faced with a challenge. What is within our control? There's a lot that's not in our control, but there's always something. Identifying positive problem-solving steps that we can take. Gratitude is another really, really important practice for well-being. And just simply making, finding a way to cue yourself during the day to be thankful for something and practicing that with your kids. It could be as simple as before you go to bed at night, identifying just a couple things to be thankful for, and then practicing that every day. And I like to use gratitude just in any moment where I'm feeling stressed or anxious, because coming back to that place of gratitude, our brains have a hard time kind of staying in stress and gratitude at the same time. So gratitude acts like a balm sometimes. Strengthening our connections, right? Social support systems are huge in resilience. So whatever we can do, calling someone we haven't spoken to in a long time, taking a class, learning something new, another way to connect with people who might have an interest in something similar to ours, and helping our kids do the same thing. So ways to connect with our friends and family without screens, without social media, because social media also has its not so wonderful side. But board games, I think we forget sometimes how much fun those things can be. Card games, cooking, baking together. Baking can also be, doing something that you follow all these steps and then there's this thing at the end that you achieve. That can feel good. And sometimes if life is out of control, well, I can make these cupcakes and then I can be like, I can do something. It helps us to feel better. Something simple. Arts and crafts, puzzles, volunteering, playing sports, just getting out there and engaging with our family and our friends and new people in ways that don't involve our screens. And I'm going to end it with this quote from Bre Brown, just because it speaks to, I think, a lot of what we've been talking about. Joy collected over time fuels resilience, ensuring that we'll have reservoirs of emotional strength when hard things do happen. It doesn't have to be huge and it doesn't have to be, long, short moments, precious moments, laughter, but collecting those moments of joy, those are the things that are going to get us through when it gets rough. And I will pass it on to whoever wants to wrap us up.
Andrea, thank you. I love that last note, especially and I think in times of stress, we want to beef up how many of those pleasurable activities that we can engage in general. We have just a couple of questions, and really this is for anybody who feels compelled to chime in to answer. But because we talked a lot about kind of the inner workings of the hospital and that level of care, can somebody share a little bit more about the other levels of care for people who maybe don't need to be patients? They don't need hospital level, but still want to care for their mental health and take care of that for themselves. Anybody feel compelled? Natalie, do you want us to answer that one?
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, I was muted for a minute. If we had a quarter for every time someone said, sorry, I was on mute during this pandemic, right? Yeah, so different levels of care, going from like the lowest level of care would be outpatient counseling. And that's where you go and you see your therapist, once a week, once every other week, typically for an hour, and you do therapeutic work with them. And then the next level of care would be intensive outpatient, which is typically every day counseling, like Monday through Friday. And there's a wonderful company that offers telehealth intensive outpatient care. It's called Charlie Health, and we refer to them all the time because it's very helpful for kids who need that counseling more often, but maybe don't have, excuse me, don't want to leave school. They don't want to have to leave school early. They don't want to miss anything at school. Charlie Health offers counseling after school hours and through telehealth. So kids can go about their daily business and then come home and see their therapist for that intensive outpatient care. And then the next level of care would be partial hospitalization, which is where kiddos go to a facility. So like at our PHP, it's like 7:30 to 3:30, I believe. So it's during school hours. And we have Fort Worth ISD teachers on staff. And so I think about it's either 3 or 4 hours of the day is doing schoolwork so that they don't get behind in their schoolwork. But we also offer group counseling, individual counseling, family counseling, recreational therapy, art therapy, all kinds of different things for them throughout the day to focus on whatever their mental health concern is. And then, of course, the highest level of care is inpatient psychiatric care, where they are hospitalized for a time.
Excellent. Thank you for answering that so thoroughly. And I will add too, before I get to that next question, if there is really, if there's any need for a student or family in our community, you know, really great place to start seeking that information is your school counselor. They're there with your kids every day. They have access to resources, some of which Natalie mentioned. We're aware of all the partial hospitalizations in the area. We're aware of many of the outpatient counselors, the inpatient facilities, and we can help kind of navigate a really complicated mental health system. And that's what we're here to do. I know Colleen had mentioned too in our Aspire strategic plan that we have plans to create a system for meeting mental health, social, emotional needs of both staff, students, all of those things. We have a system, but we are also swiveling with things that come up in life, like a pandemic thrown at us. And so we are continuing to seek to just better and better what we already have in place. Okay.
Tiffany, another great place to start for families, especially if maybe your kiddo is uncomfortable talking to a counselor or for whatever reason that's not available, you can always start with a primary care physician as well and asking those questions. Hey, I've noticed some mood changes. Hey, can you talk to my student or my child about what's going on with them? That's also a really great place to get referrals for other services started.
Absolutely. Perfect. Okay, here's another question. Can any of you speak to the average wait time that it's taking to get into both a psychiatrist and a counselor? Are there any wait times for some of the other levels of care that we talked through? Just so families know what to expect. Anybody can chime in on that one. Natalie, if you're answering, will you unmute yourself? There you go. Thank you.
Am I unmuted now? Because on my end, it shows that I'm muted. Lordy. So for psychiatrists, they typically have decently long wait lists anyways, but especially during the pandemic, it's gotten a lot worse. So I believe our outpatient psychiatrists right now have like a 6 to 8 month wait list. And so I don't even refer to them anymore because if a kid needs help, they need it sooner than that, right? So a lot of the time I will refer out to, I just look it up on psychologytoday.com. You can choose what insurance you have. You can type in your zip code, and I'll just print out a list from that for families. You can also filter by psychiatrists that are accepting new patients. So if they have a super long wait list, they're going to say we're not accepting any new patients. So that's a really good resource to find somebody in your area. And I also like using Teladoc. That's an app that you can download on your phone, and it's not just for mental health services. It's for any type of health services. But there are a lot of providers that you can access through Teladoc that maybe you couldn't access in person because they're in a different state, they're a far drive away, whatever, but you have a lot of access to psychiatrists that way. And I don't know if they asked about waitlists for counseling. It kind of the same answer. I don't think that waitlists are as long for counseling as they are for psychiatrists because there's more counselors than there are psychiatrists. But you can use Psychology Today to find a therapist as well as a psychiatrist. And there's all kinds of online platforms that you can find a therapist on. BetterHelp is one that's pretty popular. And then for me, it's a little bit different because I can take kids right away. I don't have a wait list right now, but in our outpatient psychology department, I believe that they do have a wait list. Not as long as the psychiatrist though, but it may take a month or two before you can get your kid in to see one of them.
What I found on average is that it's for counseling, it's about 4 to 6 weeks wait. But I will say that a lot of times clients will fall off in the summer. So if you've got some issues your kids really need to work on, summer might be a really good time. If you're going to be in the area, you might be able to get in faster.
Great tips. So many great tips. And I really appreciate every one of y'all for engaging in this conversation. We definitely need to have more conversations about mental health. It's something we all have to focus on and take care of, just as important as physical health. So that is all the questions that we have. We are going to have this link available on our district counseling website. So you may give us a day or two, and then you should be able to find that there if you want. If you have somebody in mind you just really want to share this information with, you can find that link there. We also have many other resources, resource lists, things like that. School counselors are here to support and help. And Natalie, we are so grateful for the community partnership that we have with you guys. And just thanks for everyone who chimed in on this conversation. We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.